Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 14. Annexed. As night slowly faded, morning set in as the liveliness of birds could be heard from all around. And while the skies began to quickly light up, the darkness continued its slow retreat, cueing a friendly and nightly transition. Upon doing just this, and as Mother Nature intended, daytime lit the dark jungles below. And there, on the ground outside, several large vehicles, a man in a black trench coat, stood in silence, looking toward the jungle's floor. It was Agent Shields, and before him was a puzzling outcome he could not seem to understand. For there on the ground was what he had concluded to be his son. But this did not seem to be his son's plan. Thomas knew that Seth would reach out to Paco. He knew Seth would do as Thomas's clone was programmed to advise him to. He felt quite certain that he had watched his network's every crack and crevice, monitoring all its moving product. But how Seth wound up here within the Chancellor's camps had the agent somewhat perplexed. And while trying to connect all the dots, a man suddenly approached him from behind. The newcomer addressed the agent, who was taking a moment of silence. "Is this the one you've been looking for?" he questioned, giving Shields a moment to answer. Thomas, not addressing the soldier's question, made an entirely different statement altogether, as he seemed to momentarily shift his priorities, postponing his unit's current objective. "Ready your men, Lieutenant. Tonight, we'll be paying our friend Paco a little visit." Then, peering out into the distance, off to the east, Thomas began to see a sliver of light. And like one would skip through pages of their favorite novel, so too does this story exhibit a similar pattern. As the sliver of sun quickly became whole, rising into the once dark skies above, and ushering these dark skies away, it proudly took its place, and for the moment, it claimed the heavens overhead. But just as fast as the first half of its journey had been, it began to quickly descend, just the same. And then, off to the west, the sun now began setting over the glassy seas of the Great Pacific as it said its farewells before ceasing to exist. But as the last of its glow announced its goodbye, it highlighted a particular sea vessel on the water's surface. And as one would get closer, darkness having settled in, the lights of this ship began to shine. And there on the deck was a man with a rifle, while three others like him were positioned at their own designated watch stations. He stood there keeping watch as he observed the growing darkness quickly surround his team's small yacht. Familiar with the saga that displayed across the waters around him, he lit up a cigarette and let the cold night simply wash over him. And as each star above found a match down below, a kaleidoscope of reflections sparkled for miles around. As he smoked a few puffs, and despite a thick jacket, a shiver from the cold air found a way to his spine. As a few more followed, he felt unfazed by the breeze, as the cold air all around settled in for the night. He gazed in the distance as he thought to himself while he soaked in the calm that now surrounded him. Suddenly, without any warning, he was quickly subdued as a hand forced his mouth closed and his gun was quickly taken. Then, a man stepped in front of him who was dressed in all black as he then brought a finger to his mouth. Then, with a slight whisper, he let out a shush, cueing his new hostage to not make a sound. Meanwhile, a few steps away, and in a much darker place, a man lies sleeping on a luxurious bed while snoring his latest day away. Without a slight warning or a chance to be prepared, his door was quickly breached, and in came several red lasers fixed to their rifles, now scanning his bed. Before he could reach for his gun at his side, he was soon met with a masked figure, now just inches from his nose, halting any chance for a possible fight. The darkened figure then held out his hand as he opened his palm and blew a white dust in the waking man's face. Paco then coughed as he began to lose focus as lights flickered this way and that. Just before going unconscious, he could now see a new scene unfold as a newcomer began to approach. This man became familiar as he wore a long coat, and with both hands in his pockets, he quickly closed in on Paco. As the flickering red lights began to steady, and perhaps a second still to faint, the victim in question looked up at the agent as Thomas smiled down at Paco, who was now completely restrained. Thomas looked at his subject with a serious expression, as he watched him go completely unconscious. Then, as things slowly returned to focus, surroundings of stars began to quickly take their place. With the dizziness now wearing off, a man came into view. It was Thomas, and he stood not a stone's throw away. Paco looked around as he noticed his men, all with similar fates, each bound by the hands and sitting on the lower deck, the water now just footsteps away. Thomas looked up as he noticed Paco wake, and began to speak as his subdued audience carefully listened. While he spoke, he pulled out a knife and slipped his right glove from his hand. "How long have we known each other, Paco? 25, 30 years? He asked, while Paco watched Thomas cut into the palm of his own hand. He then hovered his hand over the water's edge as he squeezed it into a fist, allowing several droplets of blood to come out. Paco watched as the small drops hit the surface of the water, lit up by the moon, almost able to hear their tiniest of splashes as Thomas continued to speak. "You know me, Paco. You know what I like. You know what I don't." He said this, letting more blood fall from his hand to meet the sea below. That was when Thomas cued a signal to one of his men, as a man in all black approached the captives. He then grabbed one of Paco's men and brought him to his feet as he guided him to where Thomas was standing. Once by the agent's side, Paco's man was turned to face him as Thomas continued to speak. And as he continued, Paco's heart skipped a beat as he noticed a disturbance beneath the water's surface, seeming to be unset by the blood currently being spilled. "So, if you know all these things, you must know this about me as well." Then, without any warning, Paco watched as his man was pushed to his watery death. And as he saw him hit the water's surface, it wasn't much longer before he saw him swiftly pulled under. Then, as the water began to violently splash, intermittent cries for help with brief screams could be heard. And it wasn't long after that, the same watery surface became silent as it soon gained its stillness once again. That was when Thomas turned his head back in Paco's direction, and as he looked at him, he spoke once more. "I hate this God-forsaken ocean. Furthermore, and having said this, one would be wise not to get my attention while they're at sea." Thomas kept his focus on Paco, It won't end well for them. And just like that, as if it were his turn, Paco found himself brought to his feet. Trying to back out, he resisted the men that currently guided him to the deck's edge, pleading with Thomas the entire way. "What is it, Senor Shields? Please, I promise, my friend. I assure you, I can make things right," Paco exclaimed as he came to a sudden stop, barely being able to keep his own balance on the boat's edge. But as Thomas began to speak, it seemed miles away, as Paco found the image before him slightly daunting. There, just below, the ocean laid still, with a familiar shirt now slowly bobbing to its bloody surface. And then, to add further fear, as if somehow planned, the shirt was then snatched by the beast and was quickly dragged back under the darkened waters below. How many men would you say are currently in the north working for you now, Paco? 40? 50? Thomas asked, as Paco became exceedingly nervous, answering with a slight stutter in his breath. 70, 77. I have 77 men, he cried out. Thomas's eyes widened as he was very impressed with Paco's work. Wow, even after losing Kent and his men. You are a workhorse, my friend. And shaking his head with heavy disappointment in his breath, Thomas continued to speak. I just hate for it to have to end this way. 77. That's a lot of men, Paco. Terrific work. Paco looked at Thomas with an expression that pleaded with him to stop the head games, as he repeatedly looked down at the water, catching a glimpse of disturbances from time to time. Please, Senor, I beg you. I can fix this. Whatever it is you are angry about, I can make it right. Yes. Thomas, seeming to ignore his captive's pleas, put his glove back on his hand as he looked at Paco with a stern expression, lowering his voice as he continued. And when these men of yours, these men that deliver our product, who must they go through? Who stands between them and the Chancellor's camps? Paco, wishing for all his current troubles to end, quickly answered his aggressor. Me, Senor. They must go through me, he responded. Suddenly, Paco began to scream as the two Russians that held him let him hang off the edge further, unable to catch himself had they let go. But Thomas, now speaking louder, managing to talk over Paco's pathetic wailing, began to address his hostage once more. Because I'm confused, my very old friend. You see, I've found someone outside the town of Vuelta Larga. I found Seth. I found my son. I found him dead, Senor Paco. Then, looking into Paco's eyes, he continued while slowing his speech. He'd been drugged for miles, chains around his ankles. He had been beaten to a bloody pulp. Thomas then cocked his head ever so slightly and threw a menacing stare at his detained business partner. He was in one of the Chancellor's camps. He was in one of your camps, old friend. Then, ending his eye contact with his hostage, Thomas shifted his gaze to the stars as he continued to speak. So, by all means, Senor Paco, please enlighten me. If you stand guard at the only way in, and you stand guard at the only way out, then how did he end up in the Chancellor's hands? How did my son end up in one of your fucking camps? Paco, his eyes now wide, began spinning a complicated web of pure lies in an attempt to save his very own skin. No, my friend, you have it all wrong. I was going to contact you, but I was still trying to find him. I was able to contact Seth when he arrived. He was waiting for you to join us, Paco frantically spoke. But as he looked at Thomas, he noticed he was still gazing at the stars above. Nevertheless, he continued his lies, hoping that his partner was none the wiser. But then this man, this impossible nightmare, Mr. Meeks, somehow lured him away. That's when I heard this Meeks wished harm on your son. He then killed my only men on board at the time. All 3 of them. I was hoping to find him for you, Senor. I promise. En la tumba de mi abuela. But then Trevor used him as leverage. He used your son simply to save his own skin, Agent Shields. He turned him over to Santiago, simply to buy enough time to make an escape. That was when Thomas's expression changed as he began to ponder. He knew that his son had turned up near where Trevor had reportedly been. He also knew that this Trevor had also given the cartels quite a bit of trouble as of late. Finally, coming to some conclusion within his own mind, he signaled to his men as he gave a quick order. Let him go. And with that, a sense of calm slowly filled Paco's entire being. But this feeling of relief was quickly removed while he felt them completely let go, Paco now free-falling to the sharks below. Then, suddenly, to his relief, he stopped, one of the men having caught him at the very last second as Paco could hear them laugh, while one spoke a few words in a thick Russian accent.
Comrade Shields, I believe Chunky Mexican has shitted pants.
Paco, now profusely sweating, stood up straight, no longer in the Russian's clutches, as he grimaced at the brotherly-like smacks to his back, as Thomas and his men began to leave. The cartel contractor, still bound but free from further incident, looked down into the water as he could see a trail of blood glimmer in the moonlight. He lost himself for a moment as he appreciated the air he breathed, while Thomas's last words began to echo in his mind. Well, as much as I love our little chats, I simply must be going, Paco. Of course, in the future, I will be expecting much clearer communications between you and me. We wouldn't want another misunderstanding like this, now would we? Paco's heart finally began to calm down as he heard Thomas make his last comments quite loudly. I liked your other boat better. This one doesn't suit you. Let me guess. Mr. Meeks was responsible for that too. As Paco slightly trembled, rolling his eyes at the accurate guess of his superior's last words, he slowly turned around to watch his remaining men come to their feet. Thomas and his men were now completely gone from sight. Finally, the threat now fully removed, Paco dropped to his knees, desperately attempting to regather his plexus. As darkness firmly held its grip, the murkiness of nearby mist only added to the obscurity that the skies were currently mired in. With intermittent flashes flickering from this way to that, swirls of clouds could be seen many times over, as the storm overhead kept shifting from one shape to the next. While few stars twinkled upon the vast seas below, their story is that of a victory lap as unlike their counterparts in the heavens overhead. These distant lights prevailed through the thick fog below. And upon completing such an impressive and extraordinary task, they didn't stop there as they shined upon the sea, casting the great oceans below in a blanket of pulsating reflection. Upon viewing this scene, so dark and so vast, it is within this reflective starlight that one sees something of great importance. There, amongst these pulsating impressions and above the watery surface below, a seaplane could barely be seen while hastily heading to its next destination. The plane seemed nearly silent, as it was muffled by the thunder which boomed from all around, effortlessly drowning most everything else out. And while the storms above, within their heavenly clouds, continued their deafening roars, they loudly announced their subject of interest, a tempest-like scenery that could be seen for miles around. And in this vehicle are 3 people with a new objective, now far ahead, as one begins to find themselves once more in a very dark yet familiar space. And as they continued their journey, they cautiously stole a moment of pause, as for that time being, they tried to relax, giving body and mind a much-needed reprieve. As the 2 remained silent while they took shifts to keep watch, Trevor looked behind himself and checked on Kit, who was quietly curled up near the back. As they hit several storms, while skirting their edges, he felt the plane's vibrations as he watched the interior continuously shake. Trying to ignore this unnerving sound, he turned back around and peered through his window. While he watched the distant flashes play a familiar game of cat and mouse, he allowed his mind to eventually wander. He just stared in silence, feeling the strong winds from underneath his seat as he watched the heavenly commotion just outside take a resounding hold. And then, strangely, feeling one with the chaos from out his window, he began to slip deep in thought as he stared into the darkened and distant night skies. He then sat there and pondered, trying not to dwell on the thought which filled his heart with a heavy wave of emotions. But then, unable to avoid it, as he looked deep into the dark sky outside, he now found himself far away and in a much different place in time. He then found a rush of warmth quickly settle in as he found himself in a familiar setting. Not much safer than the one that he currently found himself in, it still seemed far better, he thought. For at least this one was back on the ground. He was now in a distant memory, as him and his late sister were in a small and familiar truck. And as if very close, yet still so far away, her voice began to make Trevor feel at home. Her eyes then lit up with a sparkle, while she let out a giggle, looking to Trevor as she spoke. "Beck's plan? And what exactly is Beck's plan?" she said, cueing Trevor's memory to further, and within his own mind, as if he were there, he looked at her and gave his reply. "Whatever is theirs will become ours," he said. "We'll hold the advantage." Just then, a gust of comfort wrapped him in a very warm blanket as his sister's cheerful laugh filled his entire mind. Beck smiled as she responded to her little brother. "Sounds good to me," she said with a grin. Then suddenly, Trevor felt utterly hopeless as he reached for Beck in desperation, not wanting this to end while he felt himself now slowly slipping away. And then, just as sweet begins to sour, he was now in an entirely different memory. This place he did not like at all, as he noted a familiar vehicle. A vehicle that had met its demise. A vehicle that was jammed up against a familiar, large tree. Unlike his typical recollection of this moment, however, his wounds from that fateful evening were simply not there. He then felt Delilah's hand squeeze his own. Then, as her eyes met his, he looked down upon her, an anchor-sized weight now dropping within his own gut, as he knew what was soon to come. As he looked into Delilah's large yet childlike eyes, he held back his tears to comfort the small girl as he began to finally speak. "Delilah?" he questioned in a very scratchy voice, trying to hold back his rapidly descending emotions. But Delilah didn't answer. Instead, she just simply pointed ominously at the damaged vehicle in question. And as Trevor looked up and toward that vehicle, he noticed a dark, lifeless figure slouched near the shattered glass. Beginning to move forward, he attempted to confront this awful sight as he opened the door in front of him, shaking ever so softly as a slight tremble began setting in. But when he stared within that vehicle, a sight he didn't expect met his eyes. The vehicle was empty. Then, making Trevor that more uneasy, he felt a cold breeze upon his neck, causing him to spin around. Now, there in front of him, Beck stood where Delilah once was, her face bloodied from the bullet having taken her eye. "Trevor, you need to wake up. She needs your help. Use your sight. You will see you are not in good company. She needs you to use your sight." Trevor gave his sister a perplexing stare and began to reply. But then, and suddenly, with no warning at all, he was startled by a loud thunder as he was quickly brought back to reality. While he looked around the cabin, relief quickly settled in, as everything still seemed to be in order. Yet still shaking off the funk of his days, he gathered his faculties as he gave his surroundings a much closer inspection. The cabin was dark, but far from silent, as the pilot dutifully remained in command at the front of the vehicle. But then, he noticed something odd. He noticed something very strange. As he stared at the pilot, an unnerving sight began to take place. As if he were watching a bad program on a television set, the pilot began glitching before his very eyes, glitching as if he were not physically present. And then it happened. Like a large smack with a loud crack, the two passengers now jumped as Kit quickly dismissed her sleep. Trevor looked back at her while seeming on edge as they regained their focus to the front. And there at the nose where they had heard the loud crash, just on the windshield's exterior pane, a very thick yellow liquid began to take shape. The liquid was so thick, in fact, it blocked out the entire view ahead, as the pilot seemed completely unfazed. At that point, Kit spoke up while looking at her partner as she began to approach the front of the plane. "Fuck, conducive DX4. Then, looking back to Trevor, she clarified her words. "Smart DX4 gas. Trevor, I don't think that was Logan who dropped us off." Trevor looked over at Kit, caught completely off guard from her most recent statement. He held a very shocked expression. Kit looked back at him and attempted clearing up his confusion. "Well, I never actually physically met him," she stated, sending Trevor's mind reeling with the possibilities of being in yet another trap. All transmissions between him and Lucas were classified by the last state. "Nobody's ever seen him," she said, looking at Trevor while quickly trying to calculate their next move. Kit, now looking back to the pilot, spoke quietly to Trevor, trying not to be heard by the pilot. "This doesn't feel right. I think Logan turned us in." Trevor, now feeling slightly dizzy, posed a question that seemed to be hanging in the air, now hitching a ride within his curious mind. "Who do you think he was?" Kit slowly looked back at him with an apologetic expression as she answered his question, an expression that Trevor did not find comforting. "I think that was the one man we were trying to avoid in the Philippines," she said. Then, just as slowly as she looked over to Trevor, she then looked back to the pilot as she spoke even quieter. "I think that was the Jagger." She then began to approach the cockpit. She approached it with an angry curiosity in her mind, but with a cautious step in her pace. And Trevor, following with, found it unnerving that the man at the helm, aside from glitching like a hologram, seemed to be oblivious of the whole matter. As Kit reached him first, she demanded his attention, yelling her cautionary words, while Trevor soon caught up from behind. "Do you know who you're fucking dealing with? You amateur piece of shit. I don't know who your friends out there are, but right now, you're in here with me. Land the plane now, asshole. Land us on the fucking ocean. Take us down, now." She then looked at Trevor as the pilot just sat there, staring into the greasy, thick liquid now seeping through the windshield. The silent stranger was thin, tall, and wore a dark suit, while he carried with him very plain features. With no beard or mustache, his hair was kept extremely short, while he simply sat in silence, not even seeming to notice the pair at his side. That's when Trevor looked back to Kit, and then decided to encourage the pilot to comply with his partner, as he took his first swing at the pilot's head. As his fist wound up too late to alter its path, Kit sounded off, warning Trevor of a possible threat. And then while his fist came closer, Trevor felt something incredibly strange. Instead of a blow, there was simply no contact, as Trevor felt his fist go right through his target's skull. And as if that weren't enough to give him some pause, he began to feel pulled in as his entire body lifted from the ground, seeming as if he were being consumed by the same pilot's head. Just at that moment, he felt himself forced back as the pattern he was in began to quickly reverse. Then, he quickly felt himself being thrown across the plane to the cabin's floor just below his partner's feet. Suddenly, the lights came on all at once, as Kit soon noticed a door now below her, leading to the baggage underneath the airborne plane. Catching her and Trevor by surprise, a voice sounded through the cabin speakers. It was the voice of Thomas Shields. How do you like him? He's a prototype, Darius's future soldier. I designed him myself. As he spoke, Kit looked at Trevor, still gathering himself to his feet. And once seeing he was okay, she refocused her sight at the door below her. But before dropping to her knees, she cued him of her plans, while she mouthed a few words, trying not to gain Thomas's attention. My bag. Trevor, his head now slightly spinning, looked at the pilot in disbelief as the windshield once more caught his attention. And in return, he quickly shifted his gaze, looking at the puzzling liquid just outside, now seeming to seep through the thick, glassy barrier. What amazed him even more, as one would likely guess, he noticed the strangest thing he had ever seen. As the liquid spilled through, he inspected the glass, noticing it had not sustained any damage, as the yellow liquid now appeared slightly foaming on the interior. He continued to watch as it slowly dripped down, while it puddled around him, soon beginning to boil and steam. Trevor kept looking at the curious liquid as if he were beckoned by it, as echoes in his mind soon caused him to snap out of his daze, while Kit began to yell his name. Trevor, don't look at it. It has small telepathic enzymes in it. They are very weak, but if you let them in, they'll pull you into their poisonous gases much quicker. And then, fully snapping out of it, Trevor ran over to Kit as he kneeled next to her and helped her in her efforts to reach their luggage below. That was when Thomas began to speak once more, as the gas now slowly filled the interior around them. She's right, Trev. But then again, she always is. Kit looked up at Trevor as she began to seriously panic while Thomas continued to speak. Kit looked into Trevor's eyes, unable to hide a deep-seated fear now rapidly growing inside. Why, hello there, Kit. We've missed you back here on Earth. Forgive me for not being there in person. But since our last little encounter, I guess you could say, I am just being cautious. Trevor then noticed Thomas's next words spark a deep worry in his partner's eyes. Oh, yeah. By the way, kiddo, take a good look at your new chess piece before you there. Because it's the last time you'll ever see him, we have different plans for you. Anyhow, your plane is on autopilot. You are on your way to a little island called Scarborough Shoal. Not that you'll be awake to see it or anything. Oh, and don't bother with the luggage. We had them all ejected shortly after takeoff. As Trevor looked into his partner's eyes, both unsure what moves to make next, he began to feel dizzy as Kit tried to keep him alert, calling his name repeatedly. But finally, unable to resist any longer, his head came crashing down to her knees as his world began to slowly turn dark, Thomas's voice now echoing within his mind. And just before he passed out, he heard Thomas's final words rattle the cabin around him. Hey, Mr. Meeks. Solar flares. Am I right?